Hello everyone, my name is Victor Monga. I'm serving as honorary position of CISO at Virtue Testing Foundation. We are really proud of our mission where we help 10,000 students every year at no cost. Today here with my panelists here, we are here to talk about vulnerability and asset management. I have Naomi George, VP of IT and Information Security at Pacific Dental, and Mick Cody, CTO at Armis. Why don't we start with a quick introduction, Naomi?
Hi everyone. I'm Naomi George. As Victor said, I'm the VP for IT and Information Security Officer at Pacific Dental Services. We're a national DSO supporting about 1,000 dental offices across 25 states.
Mick Cody, as he had mentioned, I'm a CTO. I've actually day 16 or 17 at this stage, newly came here. I've worked in the industry for almost 30 years. I've worked in the big four and the consulting side of the house as much as I've worked on the other parts of it, and look forward to having a good conversation.
Gentlemen, today we want to talk about asset and vulnerability management. And for 5 years old, the way I explain this is something that it's hygiene. We know we need to brush our teeth after every meal. We push it towards the end. And when we need to go to dentist, we cry about it. That is how I see asset and vulnerability management. We all know we need to do it. We all know we need to do better. It's still a problem. So for the audience, let's talk about vulnerability management as a process. We start with discovery. We look at scanning, and that's a traditional way of thinking vulnerability management, but that's not. If you're just scanning vulnerabilities, that is just assessment. From there, we also look at categorization and prioritization, and that's where we look at the severity of vulnerability and how likely it's about to get exploited. And finally, if it's going to lead to an attack, and that's where the CVSS score from scale 0 to 10, and also the MITRE's CVE comes in the light. And finally, the last stage, which I have seen is resolution, and that's divided into three. One is remediation, that we completely took away the vulnerability, it's patched, and we no longer have the vulnerability. Second, we put some mitigating controls around it so that even though vulnerability exists, but it's highly unlikely to actually exploit it. And finally, we accept the fact that the vulnerability is there. Either we rely upon the external insurance to push the liability, or we get a waiver from our board or executives that the vulnerability exists, but it's a business critical function that we cannot mitigate or we cannot mitigate or do anything about it. There's no mitigation control. So, Naomi, first question for you. Usually when it comes to vulnerability management, there are different measures that people actually take it to test if the vulnerability management working good or bad. Mean time to detect and resolve is something that people throw around. What is your measure to test if your vulnerability management process and program is working well?
Well, I think those are the two most important metrics that you need to look at. How quick you're able to detect the vulnerabilities from the point when they introduce into your system. Then once you've done that, which is where the internal processes come in, how quickly can you resolve them? And that delta between detection and resolution is really the important piece that I think a lot of people don't focus on, because that gap is not filled by technology, right? It's filled by internal processes. You can detect very easily if you have the right tools, like you mentioned, scanning. But if you have the security team working in a silo, that gap between you scanning and detecting the vulnerability to the applications team, for instance, allowing you to patch that vulnerability could be months. And so away from the technology process, which Victor, you've so eloquently described, there is a business process of you building trust with the various groups within your business, understanding that the success of your vulnerability program isn't just a security measure, it's a business measure. And so once that trust is built between the security teams and the various application owners, you've got to build a process internally where you can test out those vulnerabilities, patching those vulnerabilities without breaking things, without adversely impacting core business processes. Once you've done that over time, you then build that reputation, that trust, and then over time you're showing that the delta between discovery of a vulnerability and the ability to patch and remediate the vulnerability, and ultimately sign off, like you said. If you have a vulnerability perhaps in a legacy system for which you don't have patches or hot fixes, then having a board or a leadership that understands that process and uses that trump card, if you like, just when needed, not as a rubber stamp to bypass the process. That's essentially what helps you get those metrics where you want them to be.
Mick, these are the new terms that we hear, risk-based vulnerability management, and that combines the criticality of the asset, how likely the asset is being exploited, and how the assets are talking to other assets. How does more context help more prioritization, or even helping with vulnerability management to get to a level where it's scalable, sustainable, and the security teams can actually not play the catch-up, but be ahead of it?
Mm-hmm. I would say some of the things that have happened with some of the technological parts of it, like this applies to everybody. I think there's advances obviously in what we're doing with AI, right? Some of that parts of the intelligence. I think the intelligence engines are a part of that. I also think there's a technological backlog now that we have. We've been at it for a long time, like well over 30 plus years. I could even go back 50 plus years. But the way these things occur, unfortunately, what has not occurred or changed is our maturity in general, right? So I would say we're now talking about asset patching, vulnerability management. I remember talking to people in a consulting perspective back in 94, 95, 96, and we were talking about the same thing, right? So there's a degree, even what Neme said, right, is this part of, there's the processes, the human being, the assets of what we're trying to manage, but then there's also trying to hit 90-day critical patching windows, right? So an awful lot of businesses would hold themselves to a higher standard of hitting these critical functions, but the prioritization has gotten lost, right? So when you look at risk-based functions, I think Neme is in a position, right? He used the term boards. We are now sitting in positions which we have asked for almost 2 decades, to be front and center in helping manage what I call ERM, pure enterprise risk management, but the compliance office is involved, legal's involved. There's a supply chain effect when it comes to procurement. There's aspects of where this is a business problem, right? These things end up becoming a business problem because there's impact to it. I think we all know that, but to answer the backside of that question is becoming more proactive, right? The issue that Neme would suffer from any given day is we're going to be, 3.5 million people short in 2025 when it comes to human beings for cybersecurity. We're trying to address, everyone's trying to address that by getting people more skilled up as fast as we can. But that human aspect, there's going to be a legacy, which there's technical debt. I think there's a human debt that also goes along with it. But overall, as you go into kind of treating what the next generation looks like, I think it's how do we get those alerts to events to a task, and actually meaningful tasks, right? So when the person has that response on what they're going to do next, they have something meaningful to go do, and it's actually tangible that they go fix, remediate something, put something in place, or in your case, as you said, exceptions may occur. How do I put compensating controls in there? And eventually, by the way, legal / compliance / the board is all bought in, and we're going to agree that we're going to maintain or manage that risk.
So it wouldn't be fair if we don't talk about asset management along with vulnerability management, because at the end of the day, how are vulnerabilities coming into our attention from the assets? And that assets include laptops, desktops, servers, smartphones, bring your own device, virtual assets, cloud assets, IT, OT, you name it. And asset management, that includes identifying, classification, prioritizing assets based on their criticality. One of the things that we throw around here in security world is single source of truth for asset information. And I don't think so that anyone positively, confidently, any given time, any given day, they can say, I have that asset information, single source of truth. Name, here's a question for you. We all have heard that you must know all of your assets before you can protect them from attack surface perspective and really understand what you're preventing or protecting. Share your journey when it comes to asset management, tying with the angle of vulnerability management, and how you successfully built that security program, keeping that in mind where a single source of truth was not possible, and now it is today.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. So you really can't build a security program without understanding the assets, right? The very concept of security sort of stems from the military concept of safeguarding assets. You've got to know what your critical asset is, what you're protecting, and the same applies to security. Now I think the biggest thing with asset management is that the asset landscape has significantly expanded. Just 10 years ago, an asset would be largely your core business applications and a bunch of servers and a cage. Fairly easy to manage. Good physical security, good network security, and you're done. You have an agent or two on your endpoints, and you have a close to 100% visibility of what you have. In today's world, as you mentioned, without going through the whole list, the asset landscape is massively changing, changes at speed. And I think, is there a single tool or methodology that gathers all the assets in terms of an agent, the traditional way that we've done it? No. I think what the industry has now been able to do over the last few years is build some type of abstraction layer. And so what you can do is there's several tools that will use existing tooling that you have. So if you have endpoint agents, you have network security tools, you have your BYOD management tools, you've got to have some way to gather up all that information into the single pane of glass as we describe it. And we've done that. So we're able to see across our estate, we're able to see all of our assets, cloud assets, applications. We're now in the process of maturing that further so that we can have all of these agents feed into a cost system. So beyond vulnerability management, how much are we paying for these assets when are managing the asset life cycles? We're trying to pull all of that together. Now, having done that, you then have to go back to the basics of a security program, which is classification. And by classification, I'm not referring to auto classification of assets. I'm talking about business classifying those assets, where the business understands the concept of a lifeboat. If you had a ship going down, what are the things you're going to save? What are the things you're going to put in the lifeboat? And if you're going to start a vulnerability management program from scratch, you've got to have this lifeboat concept or crown jewels or whatever phrase works for you. Essentially, start with what's most critical to your business functions. Once you've done that, you then go to the sort of tier 2 assets, which are, in my mind, what are those assets from which you can access your tier 1 assets? Because the fact that it's not a tier 1 asset on the surface doesn't mean it's less important if someone can hop through that to get onto your tier 1 assets. So once you understand that, and then the other thing you mentioned earlier on is the context, right? Because you've got to understand context, meaning how are these assets used? Not all assets are created equal. Once you understand that, build your vulnerability program around that, your prioritization around that, and then also the SLAs. If you do not define SLAs per asset type, then you're going to be spread thin, unless you have a massive team that you can spread across all the different asset groups, and I yet to find anyone who has that. You'll need to prioritize with resource, and all of that gets tied together with actionable SLAs, and that's how you build and run your vulnerability program based on the asset class and the asset categories that you have.
Mick, you talk to a lot of security leaders, and I'm sure you've heard of this phrase, a single source of truth. Right. At the same time, I think Navy mentioned something very critical, which is asset lifecycle. Mm-hmm. So when you talk to these security leaders, I'm sure some of them may have expressed this concern where EDR tool is giving them different information about the asset count and asset information. Right. They walk to vulnerability scanners, that giving them different information. Then they walk up to their CMDB, that's giving them different information. Why are they still talking about this after 20 years? And again, going back to that hygiene example I've given, what's the problem?
I don't know. I mean, we could say it's a procurement. I don't know. It could go. There's an aspect of how look, we onboard humans, right? We're pretty good at this, and I've spent a big part of my career also in the identity management area, which again has life cycles of, lever, mover, joiner. We have the same thing with assets, but because they're physical and obviously not based on a human context, I think we go through this issue of when an asset is decommissioned or not, or could have been, should have been. When in the 90s and even through the early 2000s, I think you would agree, like we used to RFID everything, we'd tag it, it'd come in, it'd get a serial number, it'd be drilled in. But at the time, I think ITIL Foundation, whatever, V1, V2 was just getting underway in the early 2000s. V3 came in 2008. If you were looking at it from a CMDB perspective, it was early. I don't know if anyone's actually truly gone. Don't get me wrong, there are large enterprises out there that I think have gone through this effort where they can feel that the CMDB is pretty good. But the CMDB players themselves also know that sometimes that way of how they get to that information sometimes is erroneous. So having multi versions of what we have today, we're way more modernized. We have now intelligence functions. We've got bigger databases of knowledge. I think we're setting ourselves up for more success going forward. But I think, if you would agree or not, I mean, is the issue around the breakdown of the human when it comes to how the assets are onboarded and how they're decommissioned. And in the case of what you're doing, there's money being left or money being expended in places which bothers the comptroller, the CFO's office, or even in the case when it comes to risk and having these devices end up in odd places or odd hands not being wiped, where we've seen breaches of sorts or a breach of a lot of information. I think as we look forward, and I'd like to think about it from this perspective, is there's a consistency now that we have through many different technological sources that the single source of truth doesn't or can be augmented in a CMDB and can be managed there more effectively, but the CMDB or the tooling for that can't be the only one going out and hunting for it. And I think if you marry that up with the overall life cycles of how we're going to treat the asset itself, it's not uncommon for us and what we do in our technology today to go in and actually use it in a ratification perspective. How am I ratifying how many tools I have? Or I'm finding out you've decommissioned over 650 assets this past year and you're still paying licensing fees for Oracle, Adobe, Microsoft, pick your du jour, and there's money going out the door. And I think those are aspects that are linked to the overall asset problem. But I think as we've done a better job, I think, looking at identity lifecycle and how we manage human movement, I think for some unknown reason, even though this is way before identity management even existed, we just can't seem to get our hands around what we're doing with assets. Now, I think as the edge continues to go away, or we don't have those hardened edges or cages or our data centers anymore, everything is kind of more in this ethereal layer that maybe there's more visibility. I have a funny feeling that this asset and how we control our applications, on any given asset, you have an application, you have a database, you could have a database, you can have an operating system. The overall patching functions of which each one of those layers creates its own complication in itself with the asset. So I think as we go forward, the overall look forward part of it is to start using good tooling, better tooling. We need to obviously improve in the vendor space when it comes to this to support that. But I also think that the businesses have to be ready, and unusually so, which I'm starting to see in the past 3 to 5 years, I'm starting to see procurement show up in the room for orals when it comes to engagements like these, or where legal and these people have vested interests in what they're doing, or I'm seeing somebody who's impacted from material management who runs SAP, or in the healthcare world, what happens to medical records, right? These people are now being brought into the overall process of what happens with asset or human management, and I think it's going to have a much better impact in the support of the CISOs across the globe.
And just to add to that, we often talk about people process technology, and it's really important that you build an asset management program, because the technology piece on its own isn't going to fix the problem. And I think if you go back to the genesis of this problem, we were using agents to try and gather information on endpoints, which is very effective if you have an agent. But you don't have agents for everything.
Right.
And so suddenly, especially in a world where you have BYOD, which I coined bring your own disaster, everyone brings their own whatever it is, right? Endpoints, phones, servers, applications. All of these end up having corporate information. So question is, if I bring my personal device and that personal device ends up hosting, holding, storing, processing corporate information, should you as an information security team manage a part of my device? The question is, the answer is yes, you should. Whether you build a corporate container in that device or not, it doesn't matter. So my first point to make is you've got to go away from just an agent-based approach. You've got to look at the holistic view of all the assets that you have and ask yourself, how are you getting that information? The second piece is you need that human check-in. Now let's talk data centers, and you mentioned a really good point. I have done data center audits in the past where I've been to my data center and found appliances plugged in, powered on, spinning away for services that we've retired years ago.
Right.
The problem is you're no longer paying for that service, so you're not getting patches for that service. You're not getting updates for that service, but it's still got as much access now as it's always had, which is a huge security risk because anyone can come in and, you're coming through your lowest defense point, and then from that point you radiate across the rest of the organization. So you got to build an asset program, put in the human check element. You've got to make sure you have the right tooling to gather that information, and you've got to have some type of deduplication layer that is able to take disparate data sources, put them all together, and normalize the data. Right. And that's what gives you the elusive single pane of glass that we keep talking.
And to close that out, right? The biggest thing is it's got to be everyone's job, right? So the days of old when people like you or I in any positions I would have held in a chief security officer role, the finger just can't be coming in one direction, right? The issue is that there are human beings that are in the business, running a business with legitimate reasons to do the things they do, that they need access to the asset that has the data, that has the application for them to do their job. But then that requires everyone to adhere to said policy that the compliance officer and legal counsel has signed off on. And if we enforce it, right? And that's the part of that. That's the back end of the asset lifecycle. You got to close the door, right? And that's the part of it.
And that's what I'm seeing and hearing from both of you is that maturity where we used to control our vulnerability management 10 years ago with the CVSS score. 0 to 10, anything critical and high, patch it, and that was okay. But with now, we need context. And that single source of truth has to be agents, plus where we don't have agents, we still need visibility. So like getting that context from all sources is very important instead of talking to each team separately and getting different numbers, which again doesn't make sense. So,
yeah.
So Mick, you mentioned about having this complexities with vulnerability management, patching, and having different tiers. And about 10 years ago, it was successful when we looked at the vulnerabilities in an angle and we're critical and high, patch it. But yet we missed those. We missed the days. We missed those patches. Of course we have, and that's how the incidents and major breaches happened. The assets are being spun in and out before IT and information security can even catch it.
Right.
The notion of installing agent on every single asset so that we can get visibility is outdated because there are assets that you cannot install agent and yet you want the visibility for obvious reasons.
Right.
Asset information, asset management, criticality, and tying it back to the vulnerability management. How the assets are talking to each other within my network.
Right.
That creates blind spots for obvious reasons.
Right.
So give us some of your insights and advice to our security leaders where how to measure these blind spots and how to actually compensate and remediate these blind spots and get the visibility.
Right. I would think we're obviously working, in a lot of cases, and I'm not going to pick on certain verticals more than others, but if you look at all of the verticals when it comes to industries, whether it's retail, banking, healthcare, energy, they all have issues at any given stages. I would say some of the industries are still lagging behind where the human element still causes this issue, right? So the spinning up and turning down at will tends to fall into great categories of where we used to still have, and we still do have shadow IT popping up all over the place, right? People have to have their own access to their own thing, or in certain organizations, which happens in certain verticals where the IT services just can't keep up. And their whole mission is, I'm doing cancer research, I'm doing this, I'm doing whatever thing that's the most important thing in the world, and I've got to get this done. So I'm going to spin up a piece of technology. It'll cost me $52. I can go out and buy it off Amazon, and up it comes. I'm going to do all this stuff, possibly with private proprietary information or IP that I used. Let's throw in ChatGPT just to have that even as a more existential level of fun, and then drop it down and I bring it away. In the meantime, while that asset or assets were alive for 30 plus days, something could have escaped, or did in most cases, or was attacked from an outside, unknown particular set of intruders. So when you look at it from that perspective, I think we've got to go back rudimentary before we talk about the technological part. We still have to get back to somebody at the upper levels has got to get in line with the CISO and go like, hey, we asked you to do this. We've been doing it this way. We're going to improve our capabilities and what it is to deliver better services to you, but you got to stop doing this, right? That's number one. Now, actually seeing it, you can't have an agent on everything. A lot of the times, look, this happened to all of us through any one of the endpoint players, anyone who got into this space. Sometimes those DLLs or loading DLLs or EXEs up on some of these boxes. Some of our boxes weren't ready for it, and it knocked them over. So there's new approaches now where we can kind of sit and tap into the network area and actually look at true DNS information, see it at a different level. And this applies not just to the IT side, it applies to the OT side, right? So in our world of when you live, say, energy and healthcare, where they have things that are compromisable, which create human safety issues, right? It's not uncommon that there are now vendors out there who are arriving in at the existential medical sites, or they're arriving in the Balkans or the Permian Basin, and they're arriving and saying, hey, look, we got this new thing that'll go into this. You can do it, and it's almost like you're windowizing, a piece of technology that has sat there running, a PLC for, 20 plus years, and all of a sudden it's got a gleaming IP address associated with it. If you don't have a way to pick up that level of, there's no EXE or DLL that you can drop on that to agently see that. So a lot of the companies and the way we look at it ourselves and what we're doing today is to improve that level of visibility. And we found by tapping into the upper layers of the network and then of course picking up on the other sources of truth, right? EDR tools, anything else that ties into, we can find a good center function, is to homogenize everything at a layer that gives you the best, particularly for him, the best level of visibility we can in a much more ongoing state. Because that's where the asset, that's this life cycle, going back to the prior question, right? The only way we're going to do that in a consistent way is to give you the best visibility. So we're on that journey now. You've already stepped into this journey and you're kind of mostly all the way through it. I think certain parts of what we're going to look at now is improving the maturity going forward. But we as the vendor community have to do a better job too, right? I mean, that's not just on them, and having people like NAMI and or other customers holding us accountable to a greater degree to get that to happen. I think that's where we're going to go.
Since we're talking about your journey and how you matured the asset and vulnerability management and Pacific Dental, incident deployment, urgency, exceptions, you're in healthcare, and I'm sure you get these requests at all times. Accommodating these requests along with making sure that there's no blind spots must have been difficult. So for our listeners and audience, share your journey from asset management, vulnerability management, and how you evolved from where you were and where you are today, where reducing the blind spots is the priority.
Yeah. So I think like most folks, just being effective at patching, doing the remediation on those core services is where we started. Right, without diving into a lot of the vendors that we use, I'll talk you through our journey briefly. So we've covered asset management. We had to do that. We had to run through all of that, discover our assets, and see what was our most exposed assets and start there. Obviously, it'll come as no surprise to anyone listening that going back 7 years, servers and endpoints were our biggest pain point. So we started using some of the traditional vulnerability and patch management tools that are out there. And those were effective to a degree, but at the time we had an MPLS network. And so when you're pulling down significant data sizes all at once over an MPLS network, that causes a significant choke point. And you often hear people talk about this trade-off between productivity and security. Right. When, as the head of a security team, I am essentially stopping operations from running. Things like backups and overnight and sync reconciliation jobs are not able to run simply because I'm trying to keep the business secure. It just doesn't make any sense. So we kind of went into a second level of maturity, was using better tooling that allowed us to do what we did before without adding unnecessary load on the network. So we did that, and that was pretty successful. Again, think about it from a server client standpoint. And then as we start getting into the OT, IoT space, and some of these embedded machines in healthcare, you have a lot of technology that have embedded operating systems. A lot of these are OEM's closed unit devices, and you cannot install agents on them. And so you've got to start thinking beyond just sticking an agent on everything. And so the next level of maturity was, hey, let's bring in tools that use some of the existing technology that we have, whether that's on the network, so you can isolate on the network, or you could apply updates. So using the existing technology stack and stitching it all together, using a tool that pulls all that together. So we get the visibility, and we have the ability to do remediation across the entire lifecycle, not just things that you have an agent on. And ultimately where I want to go, which is maybe new, novel for the industry, is really bring the enterprise to the level of the home. And that might sound really silly at first take, but think about using your whatever phone. Let's take an iPhone for argument's sake. You have an iPhone that's been sitting in the drawer for 10 years. You bring it out, you power it on, it still works, it still holds a charge, and you want to give it to your kid, right? All of a sudden you realize that Apple are no longer producing updates for that particular generation of iPhone that you have. There's certain applications that may still work on that device, even though it's not up to date. There are other applications that will not even let you access those applications in the App Store. And I think that's the approach we need to bring into the enterprise, where we get to the point of maturity where IT, the technology function, pushes out updates on a continuous basis. Now, obviously, you can't do this for every asset class, but especially for the endpoint consumer devices, hey, you want to use your device? That's fine. That's an update. You click on the update. The more you delay that update, the more the updates pile up, and eventually you get to a point, that may be a week, that might be 2 weeks, where if you don't get the update, well, you cannot use your device, right? So you've got to remove the policing and the enforcement of security from the security teams, because we're never going to grow linearly with the size of the organization. You've really got to push out this consumerization of security and let the end users understand that their productivity and the ability to work is really up to them, and how much they embrace the overall security posture. And you make them champions rather than reluctant, users of security technology.
Do you think that's where there's pushing, where the macro micro thing is much more prevalent? Like we've been listening to Zero Trust forever, right? But SASE really exploded into the market pre-COVID, and then it really took on its effects. And then there were benefits, right? Tremendous amount of benefits, from a release of cost, infrastructure, and other things that were going on based on how we did it. But we also found that we can make things more secure by that isolation, thinking of macro, micro. And I think that will also improve the overall posture. Yeah. We've got to help with the visibility part for sure. But at the end of the day, I think if we start looking at it through the eyes of where SASE is 1.0 is, where it's going to go 2.0 and onward, we have to plug the asset lifecycle part of what we're thinking into that part of it. We've done a good, like I said, I think the identity part of it is becoming what it is. Application inventory is part of that. But at the end of the day, we have to touch an asset to get to some of these things. So where do they stand in their overall independent posture matters on what your overall enterprise posture looks like.
And as the edge is breaking, I think identity, asset, and vulnerability management is going to start to have to pull the context together instead of having that silo information. It has to bring together, because there is no longer edge for obvious reasons.
Right.
Now, gents, we've been talking about vulnerability management, asset management, identity, context. It wouldn't be fair if I don't bring in compliance conversation in this one. CIS Top 10 still talks about inventory of hardware, software, we're still there. And again, when it comes to business drivers and return on investment, when it comes to putting into the program, the software, the platform people need, it's still a conversation that every security leader is having either with executives or board or even to their own teams. Like, we need to do better vulnerability management. We need to get better at asset identification and tying back the context. We cannot be living this loop of let's patch critical and high and then miss the window. Maybe at Pacton, when you are working with your teams and when the compliance conversation comes in, when audit conversation comes in, what is the journey, what is the conversation, what are the insights that looks like when it comes to compliance lens of asset management and vulnerability management?
Well, I think the most important thing outside of everything we've talked about is, from a compliance standpoint, you've got to set firm metrics that help drive your vulnerability management program. Now, I look at compliance with two very different but related lenses, right? The first is compliance to your SLA. And the way that I would describe this is you've got to define acceptable levels of measurement. So for instance, if your aim for your vulnerability management and ultimately your patch process is to patch your applications up to 95% minimum, then that's your goal, right? And you have to report on it. If you don't report on it, then you're never gonna improve the process. Now, below 95%, so let's say you go below 95, you can set another threshold to say between 85 and 95%, not where I wanna be, but I'm gonna leave this up to my operations team to get at it, to deal with the various teams, to build that relationship and essentially try to understand why. And there are reasons why. You may be in between an operating system upgrade, for instance, and there are no current patches for the OS that you currently have. In which case, you've gone from a vulnerability management conversation to essentially a software deployment conversation.
Right.
You've got to deploy the right software, get everyone up to a level that a vendor is now releasing patches so you can then carry on. So you leave that window, in my case, say 85 to 95%. But then you set the floor. And the floor is, we will not go below 85%. And if it goes below 85%, then these are the triggers, right? The exec is involved, the VP is involved, the risk committee is involved, whatever that case is. So you've got to build that cadence within the organization. And then you also have to build out a very cyclical, repetitive process of saying, we will check this every quarter, month, whatever the case. I would not suggest a quarter, just to be clear. You need to do it a lot more frequent than that. So that's the first thing. Compliance to your internal policies, your internal metrics. And your metrics come out of your policy. The second thing is you've got to be compliant to the frameworks and, in some cases, regulatory environments that you're in. So depending on your organization's regulatory frameworks, you may need to comply with FedRAMP, SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, High Trust, or whatever the case may be. There are very firm expectations of those essentially control objectives that these frameworks expect you to do. Again, I will take those and I will filter those into my corporate policy, which ultimately then roll into actionable operational metrics. And that's how you essentially ensure that your compliance drives your security program. Otherwise, you hear a lot of people say, we're compliant with HIPAA or we're compliant with ISO 27. Like, what does it mean? If you're not able to just digest that high-level statement into very defined control objectives that you can measure their effectiveness by further defined metrics, which you then check on a predefined basis, then you don't have a program and you clearly cannot claim to be compliant.
But that was the comment in the old days, right? Being compliant doesn't make you secure, right? And one of the things I think it happens with our compliant officers, they're very supportive, right? I find them to be, if they can be used in an effective way because of the linkage to the business. What you just spoke about, right, was business-driven decisions, right? We have the technological, wherewithal to provide you that information, but we can't make that decision about the business. You have to help us. This is a bigger problem. Because terminology was derived, I think, what, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, started using the word resilient, right? Yeah. And that's where, that's when now you're mixing in business impact analysis in conjunction with cyber. And now we're starting to make better decisions as businesses on what we're doing to support us or people in MA's role to kind of get the next iteration of where we're going with it, right?
Mick, you talked to a lot of customers and you talk to security leaders, practitioners, defenders. You have been a security practitioner yourself. At this point, when you talk to your customers and they tell you that I have more than 100 or 200 tools and different platforms to manage my vulnerability asset management, and then mix that with compliance, right, what's your suggestion about consolidation? What's your suggestion about looking at the different assets and we talk about software and hardware assets.
Right. It's interesting. I'll defer to Nemi on how he gets to his decision criteria, but there is a group, and I think there's a bunch of practitioners in the CISO suite that have ended up with 100, sometimes upwards of 200 plus tools, and decisions of our pals over in infrastructure and cloud and all the other groups that are over there, particularly also our business-driven application users, who have kind of come up with the next best thing, right? So there was a period of time where we were very involved in buying everything in the right-hand corner of the Gartner quadrant, right? So I've got one of everything. And over a period of time, I think what we found is that being good and being good enough is good enough, right? And because we come in and we use our own tooling ourselves from a ratification perspective of where you can see everything running at what I kind of spoke of earlier. But that also matters to a cyber posture, right? You have to look at it from that perspective, almost sometimes where too many tools is a bad thing, right? And it actually creates too many places for you to land where you're trying to put too many eyes on glass. And here we suffer again the human and asset issue because there's not enough humans to manage all the assets. So the simplification of what it is, I think is a huge part of it. And I think the more and more I'm out in the field over the past 2 to 3 years, I would tell you that I'm starting to see CIOs and CISOs come together and going like, okay, we don't have to have everything in the right-hand quadrant. We've got suites of stuff that we've bought from other people. Are there parts and pieces that we can get from them that is in the right-hand quadrant, but just not in the far right-hand quadrant? And are they effective enough to make a good job? Sure, yes they are. But it's also a cost-effective decision that you will do that, right? And I think it leads, overall, I think it leads to better posture. Remains to be seen on how we're getting to what we're working towards, in overall ratification in general. But, it's hard in this current economy, for everyone to go out there and buy things willy-nilly. Everyone's cinching their belts pretty hard right now. So you got to maintain this level of cyber posture because they're not stopping, banging down our doors on a daily basis right now. So we still have to do a good job with what we got, right?
And I expect that would help with the prioritization of what needs to be remediated or what needs to be putting actually compensating controls around the asset that has vulnerability that can be exploited.
Right. I think there's a part of it, and you can tell me from the EOL perspective, that's a prime example, right? There are going to be assets that are finally, we have to decommission them, right? They're just not going to be. There's platinum services offered by lots of companies on the outside to keep those things running and going, but that may not be the good solution. You can only put enough compensating controls around certain things because eventually those compensating controls actually go back to the old school way of what we were doing, kind of isolating them onto hard targets, and it becomes a harder way to manage that, and the expense and administration of that is also high.
You're pretty much just accumulating technical debt over time, which leads a lot more overhead to manage. The way that I look at it is, if I had to paint a house, I always talk about cake, but I'm going to talk about painting a house today. It's much better. So if I had to paint a house and I had a choice, I had $1,000 and I wanted to buy the best rust, mold, resistant paint in the world. Then I did my calculation and it turns out I would only be able to paint half of my house with this perfect paint that will stand forever. All right, self-healing paint, let's just make that up. Would I do that, or would I go maybe a step lower than that tin of paint to get a can of paint that actually paints my entire house? In the real world, this is not even a discussion that you will have. There is only one answer. I want to paint the whole house because I only have a finite amount of money and a bucket of paint. In the security world, we end up going for the best tool there is, usually by default. And then I got to go back to the cake, and then we end up with this beautiful icing on one segment, maybe even one layer of a 10-layer cake. And then we say, we've iced the cake. It is fundamentally foolish, right? So the ability to get visibility, to spread what you have across the estate. You mentioned a few things, Mick. The one thing I took away from that is visibility. You cannot secure things that you don't know or things that you cannot see. So I would go for, some people talk about best of breed versus best of suite. Well, I don't really gravitate to use those terms. I talk about best integration. Because what I'm doing may not be best of breed, may not even be the best of a suite, but if I have individual tools that integrate together, and we can do that today thanks to API security and all the various integration middleware that we have, if that gives me visibility across my estate, then I've won the first battle of asset management and all of that. If I then have the ability to throw on remediation as part of that, so using the tools that I have independently, whether they're EDR, XDR, NDR, whatever the DNRs, if I have that combination and I'm able to take action based on the intel that I have received, then I have a program. Now, the final thing to tie that all together is this concept that I refer to called a placemat. And if you have all the tools in the world, but you're not able to bubble these things up to, for simplicity, I'll say 3 or 4 basic metrics. The first is maturity. You can use a very simple scale, 0 to 5. You can use CMMI or all the tools out there. If you're not able to independently say that my security program 3 years ago was a 0 out of 5, and today, after spending $500,000 or $20 million, I'm at a 2.5 over 5, then you don't have a program. So you've got to be able to independently measure maturity. The second thing that you have to measure, which are not always the same, is the effectiveness of your controls. So having taken this visibility of your entire environment, what are those choke points? Go back to the lifeboat. Start from there and build outwards. How effective are the controls that you're putting in? I'll give you one simple example. A few years ago, when everyone was in the data center, we had a lot of data-centric security tools that essentially took a network tap, and then all of your data, all of your traffic was hairpinned through the data center. And as long as you had a device at that choke point, you had almost total visibility. Now, along comes SD-WAN, and we have a diversified direct-to-cloud network architecture, and a lot of people still have those tools in the data center. So if you look at the effectiveness, back to the cake and the paint, you've got a great tool, nothing wrong with the tool, but you've got a great tool giving you great visibility of 20% of your estate. Then the final piece, which is more of a business, because what's the point of security if ultimately there isn't a business outcome of it, is your risk. Because depending on your industry, all of the tools and all of the maturity that you've put in place may not be reducing your overall business risk as much as you want. Because some of the risk that you deal with may just be the type of business you do, the nature of the regulatory environment, the nature of the threat landscape, and so you've got to understand risk. And in the end, the visibility, the effectiveness of the control should ultimately play a role in reducing that risk. And where it doesn't, your board, your leaders should understand that residual risk and be comfortable with that risk. If you're able to pull all that together, then you have a program, you would have built something that will stand the test of time.
Right. Or be resilient, right? I think one of the things to kind of close that out, one of the parts and pieces I'm seeing is even a terminology I think I had coined way back in the day, and and talked about lots of people have used it or are about to use it, which we were talking about earlier, which is, I hear about ROI out of this, or I get ROB, realization of benefit, and go like, but there was this other group that I always kind of ran across also, and in your particular case, you're doing this, but you're doing it through the auspices of the business, so it protects you, but there are still a group and groups of verticals of industries that are still doing what I call RON, right? I call it the return on negligence, right? The cost of doing nothing. You keep kicking the can down the road and go like, well, it's just the days and times we live in, right? That is a terrible way to go about thinking about what you're going to do. And certainly no compliance officer or legal counsel will be ever supportive of anything you do. There are ramifications to what you do with your money and how you get the most for your money, but it has to be driven through traditional functions of resilience that I think our business partners have now started jumping on board with us to help and support what we need to do. And I think it's great because you guys now, we have more access to the board level than we've ever had in the past. I think that's where the impact has been made the most.
Well, gentlemen, I don't know any other point than this to end this conversation. And thank you both for being the panelists and giving us insights into asset management, vulnerability management. Thank you for sharing your journey, how you evolved, and Health Pacific Dental. Thank you very much, Mick.
Absolutely.
Mike.
Thank you.